Welcome back, everyone. This is part two in our ongoing series about Christians and politics and how we should relate to that. This will be a three-part series, and this is part two. I hope that this video finds you healthy and well and managing to get through this time without too many difficulties. I hope that all in your family are safe and well and not suffering from this virus. My heart today is really heavy and saddened by the fact that a friend of mine who I worked with as Santa at Bass Pro, his son passed away from this COVID-19 and left behind a family with young children. And I'm just heartbroken over that, as I'm heartbroken over so many who have lost their lives during this pandemic, and really many unnecessarily because of how we have failed to treat and approach this pandemic. So my thoughts and prayers go out to Richard and his family, and also I would like to say that my thoughts and prayers are always with you, that you are safe and healthy and make it through this pandemic without any loss of life touching you, your friends, or your family. So we pick up our second installment of this, and I want to start talking about a couple of traditions that we see within Christianity. There are typically two traditions within Christianity that deal with politics. The first is the Constantinian, which is the church running the state. This results, or it always results really, when the church runs the state in oppression and even death and the likes. It's kind of a join or die, type of mindset. And we saw this for 1,260 years, from 538 to 1798, when Catholicism had joined with and actually ran the state until Napoleon kicked the Pope out and actually put him in prison in 1798. So this is the kind of thing that occurs when theology or religion actually ends up running the state, and that includes Christianity. The second tradition is the prophetic tradition that we see in the Bible, which is a condemnation of the oppressive social actions against the weak that the state sanctions by not correcting. The prophets were given this particular burden by God to speak out against this oppression at the hands of governmental structures within the government of Israel and even within Babylon. When Daniel spoke to Nebuchadnezzar, the prophets were sort of moral auditors who were protesting against everything that was unjust in the political realm of government. As Christians, we too should be involved in politics, not only as moral auditors against all that is unjust, but also because we live in a democracy that is built and governed by our own actions, our own vote. As moral auditors, we are reminded, in fact, we are to tell others and to remind others and ourselves of our own commitments to one another, to live with relational integrity one to another, in loving kindness and selfless love one to another. And that includes our involvement in politics. As you've seen in the previous video, we can't escape politics at all. It's not possible. We live in this environment. Looking at the landscape around us, I think we sometimes feel righteous in our condemnation of rioters and looters when they are just a small fraction of the overall protests against racism, discrimination, and oppression. We as Christians, though, should be focused on the root causes of the looting and rioting, which is our society's failure to live with equality and relational integrity toward one another. The problem is that white people like myself are not subjected to the same injustices as people of color. And because we don't experience what people of color experience, it's easy for us to believe that these injustices are not systemic and do not exist. So when some see the slogan Black Lives Matter, they respond with All Lives Matter because they believe that equality already exists. From their myopic, jaded white privilege perspective, they believe that Black Lives Matter is nothing more than African Americans asking for a privilege and a treatment that is above that of white people. The truth is, all they are asking for is to be treated fairly and equally, something that they have never been treated as. A while back, I posted a sermon on Jeremiah 22 about how the prophet Jeremiah spoke to the power regarding the injustices perpetrated by the king on the poor and his people. I would suggest that you watch it to see how God's prophets dealt with politics in their day. Might give you a little bit more insight. Now, I think the next question is this: is there a theological dimension to the political? And is there a political dimension to the theological? In Psalms 40, verse 8, it says, I delight to do thy will. This is talking about Christ. This is a messianic prophecy of Christ. See, we have to understand that Jesus is the gospel articulated. Jesus is what the gospel looks like, out loud and in living, breathing color. So we see Jesus in the temple with the money changers, and we hear him tell the story of the Good Samaritan that we've talked about. But Jesus also said, you search the scriptures, for you believe in them, you have eternal life, but they testify of me. That's a paraphrase, of course. And then, of course, you have the story of Jesus with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, where he explained to them that all of the prophets and all the law, the entire Old Testament, was speaking about him. And therefore, the gospel is an articulation of this informal political stance that we see in Jesus that started with the prophets, who were, as we just said, moral auditors. It's all pointing to the character of God and justice for all. You see, in the beginning, the very first lie told to Adam and Eve was a lie about God's character. And everything since has been God showing to mankind what his true character of selfless love is. He's not a God of force. Yes, at times he has to intervene and use force to keep man from destroying himself, but he is a God of love and caring, and he cares for those most in need. You have to understand that justice in the Bible, when the Bible talks about justice, it is primarily concerned with the welfare of those most in need. We think of justice today as punishing the lawbreaker. And while that is true to a certain extent, the Bible is far more concerned with people who legally go about breaking the moral law in how they ignore and oppress those in need through unjust social structures, even if those structures allow it. Because we tend to be self-centered in our nature, we tend to be more concerned about punishing the looters and the rioters and the vandals than we are about correcting the legal, immoral ills of our country that have brought us to this particular point. There is much more of our time and money that must be invested in solving the underlying causes of the looting and the rioting. So our simplistic approach is often, oh, let's just lock up the rioters and the looters and that'll solve the issue. But that never solves anything. Often the work that must be done can actually be painful, as it requires us to change our own personal paradigms. It's much easier and less costly, I think, for us to blame those who are breaking legal laws instead of addressing the immoral behaviors of established systems that protect the abuses of power. We simply are not tuned into the heart of God, which is love, not force or coercion, which is often used by the structures that we set up to implement justice. And so these systems that are set up, such as law enforcement and the judicial system, are often unjust in how they administer their justice because they aren't concerned with the individual. I remember when I was going through the academy at the State Patrol, the Judge Riccio got up and said, the courts are not concerned with justice. They are concerned with the administration of law. And that's kind of the difference that we see. But what we want to get to in our governmental systems is to get to a point where the courts, the judicial system, the law enforcement is more concerned about what is just and what is right and what is good than just the administration of law. Because we are not often tuned into the heart of God, we tend to be more concerned with force and power over others to stop the looting, when love, kindness, and equality are the godly ways to truly address these issues. So, is the gospel conservative or liberal? Well, the answer to that would be yes, or better said, conservative liberal. Or you might say liberal conservative. The truth is that God nor the Bible is concerned about political ideologies as in left versus right, conservative versus liberal, or Democrat versus Republican. The politics of the Bible is concerned about right versus wrong, righteousness versus evil, love versus hate, good versus bad, especially with regards to relationships with one another. And as we have learned, politics is really about living in that relational sphere where we interact with each other and we create systems that are fair and loving and kind and just for everyone. We get into trouble when we try to bend Jesus to a specific political ideology. Jesus was just, and what he pursued was justice. When you look at Amos and Jeremiah and the other prophets, what you find is that God is on the side of the oppressed. We're going to talk more about God taking sides or not taking sides and how that plays out. Wherever the single mothers are, wherever the poor are, wherever the homeless are, wherever the sick people are, wherever the drug addicts are, wherever the imprisoned are, wherever the hungry are, wherever the oppressed alien is, or the refugee or asylum seekers are, that's where you will find God. And how do we know this? Just read Matthew 25, 31 through 46. Jesus is saying, when you see the vulnerable, the marginalized, and disadvantaged people, you are seeing me, for I am there, and I am concerned most about these people in need. I am on their side. I want to take you back to to Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. And I've talked about this in other videos, but as you remember, the night before Jericho fell, Joshua was visited by Jesus himself with a flaming sword, a warrior ready for battle. And Joshua asked the question, are you for us or are you against us? And Jesus' response was interesting. He replied, neither. Now that seems odd, but the point God was making is this. When it comes to salvation, he is on the side of everybody. He's pulling for everyone. 2 Peter 3:9 tells us he desires that none should perish. We are told It's the reason he delays his return in that passage. That's the great love of God. God is even pulling for the salvation of Trump. Even though Trump may be immoral and unfit to lead, God died for Trump and loves Trump, just as he died for Nebuchadnezzar. But sadly, generally speaking, powerful, narcissistic, intrinsically immoral men like Nebuchadnezzar and Trump have to have their power ripped away and need to spend a few years in humility eating the grass of the field before they can literally come to their senses. Let's not be too critical of Trump or Nebuchadnezzar, because in reality, most of us have to hit bottom before we realize we are powerless to save ourselves. The most difficult person for God to reach in his selfless love is the person that does not recognize their own need. So when you ask God this question, God, what side are you on? The Republican side or the Democratic side? His answer is neither. I'm on the side of those in pain and suffering who are oppressed. God is always on the side of the oppressed, the least of these, as it says in Matthew 25. So we as Christians are inspired also to be motivated by the love of Christ to follow that lead. If we love God and are in tune with his heart, we will be on the side of the oppressed, the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the disadvantaged. We will care about the sick, the homeless, the hungry, the handicapped, the imprisoned, and the oppressed alien. For that is who God is concerned about. His heart breaks because of the mistreatment of these people. And that should be what our heart breaks for as well. So when it comes to politics, we as Christians, like God, will fight to help those most vulnerable and marginalized people groups. What we speak out against as moral auditors will be those injustices. Who we vote for will be those representatives who are most likely to provide affordable quality health care for the sick, housing and food assistance for the homeless and the hungry, real prison reform that releases prisoners that have long past served their time, and work to make sure that they are reintegrated into society as valuable members of society, not ostracized and made it difficult to become a member of society again. That's what we will be pursuing as Christians, because we love others just as God has loved us. As Christians, we support and vote for those representatives who will fight for a basic living wage for everyone. And yes, those representatives that have compassion for the oppressed aliens and those children who were not born here but grew up here knowing only this country. And we will even vote for those representatives who will make those children citizens, because we value them and we love them and we want to do what's right by them. So the question you might ask is, does the preaching of the word include more than just words? Well, of course, I think we could say yes. So does the preaching of the gospel encompass the act of reducing human suffering? Of course, again, our answer should also be yes. Now, the next question is, what if human suffering is attributable not only to individuals who act inappropriately toward one another, but to systems within a government that act inappropriately toward their citizens? If it turns out that those governmental systems are responsible for oppressing and for oppression, I should say, and for suffering, then I think the question should be, does the Christian have a role to play in the effort to lessen human suffering, not only from one individual to another individual, but from one system of power towards individuals who are vulnerable, disadvantaged, and marginalized? And if the answer to that question is yes, then we should ask, what is the practical way to do that in our society and system of government, given that we live in a democracy? And since we live in a democracy, I think it would be strange to recuse ourselves from that process, as some Christians might suggest. I don't want to be involved in politics. But that's a strange statement in itself. So often I hear well-meaning Christians say that they are only concerned about lessening the suffering of others, individual to individual, what I do, okay, to you, what you do to me, okay, or maybe what my church does, okay, in society, but not from the governmental power structure toward individuals. In their eyes, it's only about what they do or don't do, or what they give or don't give personally, and not about the government for which they are actually responsible for setting up by their vote and their influence. Yet in our country, we are a government of people, by the people, and for the people. So whatever our governmental systems do or fail to do reflects our own hearts and minds towards each other. After all, we installed these governmental powers by our vote. And if they're not acting appropriately, if they're not taking the appropriate actions necessary to mitigate suffering and pain and inequality and justice in social justice norms and forms, that's on us, because we put them in power. And we can take them out of power and put other people in power who will do the right thing. But that's on us. We are government by the people, for the people. And if you're inclined to say, well, okay, I just won't vote then, and then I won't be responsible, you then become a participant in supporting those vile, evil institutions that are oppressing people and causing people to suffer. You can't escape it. To take no stance is a political statement and a political stance in support of governmental systems that allows the poor to continue because wages are too low to provide a living, the sick to die because they can't afford health care, the hungry to starve because they can't afford to buy food, the homeless to remain homeless because they don't have assistance in order to be able to put them into a home, or the wrongfully imprisoned to remain in prison, and the alien to continue to be oppressed. By taking no stance or staying out of politics, as it were, is to be involved in politics by allowing evil to continue. So as a Christian, we cannot abdicate our responsibility in a democracy, for when we do that, we become the very evil that we wish to avoid. And I have to say that there's probably something behind that ultimately that's driving us to stay out of it. And maybe it's because we actually want to acquiesce to that. Maybe we think it has something that'll benefit me. Usually it's not driven by selflessness. It's usually driven by self-centeredness. When these things are presented from people, I often hear people respond to me, oh, you're taking sides and God is neutral. When I said that God is on neither side and that he is pulling for everyone, I was talking in reference to salvation. We must remember that God still destroyed Jericho. He still destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. He still destroyed the world with a flood. It's inaccurate to say that God is neutral in the political sense. We serve a God who takes sides. God is not neutral. There have been many instances throughout history where God has had to intervene. It's not his choice, but sometimes he has to intervene with some force in order to save mankind, in order to stop the oppression and the suffering. At some point in the not too distant future, in fact, he's going to destroy the wicked in a great conflagration. He does take sides openly and boldly. He enters into human history and takes interest in those who are on the receiving end of oppression. Now, it's not true, and I want to make this very clear. It is not true that God does not love the oppressor. He does. He loves everyone equally, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you any less. and there's nothing you can do to make God love you anymore. And that's contrary to what a lot of Christians believe. What is true, though, is that those who oppress do not love God, because one cannot love God and mistreat their neighbor. Adventist churches love to put John 14:15 on their marquees, which say, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Sadly, though, they are typically referring to keeping the Sabbath, because they see that as the one commandment that people don't truly keep. But I would suggest that the greater sign of not loving God is our mistreatment of the least of these. That is to say, violating the second tablet of the Decalogue. And that includes allowing those mistreatments to go unchecked because we don't exercise our rights and responsibilities in the formal political system to curb those wrongs. There are one of two ways that we can and actually do contribute, sadly, to the evil systems of government within our democracy. Either we stay completely out of politics, as I mentioned before, which allows the evil status quo of governmental systems to continue to oppress the poor and the needy and the sick and the suffering. Either that, or we do exercise and get involved in politics, and we exercise those voting rights in an evil way by voting people into office who are not concerned about the least of these and correcting the mistreatment and the oppression and the other ills, social ills that are allowed or pressed onto the people of their nation. So, does God intervene? Yes, he does intervene. He does take sides. As I mentioned, he's taken sides numerous times throughout history. He intervened in Exodus chapter 2 on behalf of Israel because he heard their cry. And God took the side of the Hebrew people against Pharaoh. Not because God didn't love Pharaoh, but because Pharaoh didn't love God and therefore was mistreating his children. A lot of people seem to be operating under the misconception that God is this disinterested judge who wears a black robe and has to consult precedent like some sort of earthly Supreme Court justice. But God is always on one side. He is always on the side of right and justice against oppression and mistreatment of the vulnerable, disadvantaged, and marginalized. So God does take sides. So when we ask the question, is God a liberal or a conservative? And we answered yes, what's under the hood of that answer is simply this. There are conservative principles that are mixed with evil, misguided intent and application. And there are liberal principles that are mixed with evil, misguided intent and application. And Jesus is the equilibrium between every good principle along the spectrum of left or right. That's why I said earlier, he's a conservative liberal who aligns with the righteousness of the liberals and the righteousness of the conservatives. Extreme liberal elements and extreme conservative elements are manifestations of the same fallen mental illness of hate on two opposite ends of the spectrum. It's like they're on a circle, and when they come full circle, extreme to the left and extreme to the right, they meet again in the illness of hate toward one another. Now, when we go to vote, we must apply those godly principles of selfless love and well treatment of the least of these to the person or persons whom we are voting for. Specifically, the principles found on the second tablet of the commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, and in Matthew 25. You can also find them throughout the Bible. Now that I've said this, I don't want you to come away with the idea that the two mindsets, liberals and conservatives, are equivalent. They never are, and they never have been. And they do change from time to time. To say, I don't care who I vote for because they're all bad, a pox on all their houses, and that type of thing, so it doesn't matter who I vote for. That's actually a cop-out. They simply aren't the same. And they do shift toward righteousness, bend toward righteousness or bend away from righteousness, depending on what point in history you happen to be looking at. At one time, the KKK and white supremacy groups were all Democrats. But today, we now see that they are attracted to the Republican Party. So one must do the work to determine which candidate is best suited to pursue God's principles of justice and equality and fairness and help to the vulnerable and disadvantaged. This is why Christians must do their due diligence when researching political parties and candidates. We must ask ourselves the question, which candidate and even which political party may be better suited for helping the poor, the sick, the hungry, the homeless, the imprisoned, and the alien in this particular point in history. And it can change from one point in history to another. The Christian, like Christ, is not beholden to a political party, but rather to a set of godly principles of caring for the oppressed, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. Those most in need, that's the side Christians are on. We must remember at some point near the end of Earth's history, which given the political landscape I don't think is all that far away, both liberals and conservatives will find themselves in the same camp of John chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. I encourage you to go read that. There is a sense in which both the Democrats and the Republicans have one vital thing in common. They hate each other. And that hatred is actually an ungodly spiritual union. On the surface, they may look like enemies, but beneath the surface, especially at the far ends of each spectrum, the character of hate is driving both entities. They are operating by the same principles in their enmity toward one another. And that enmity binds them against their common enemy. And by the way, their common enemy 2,000 years ago was God in the flesh. Conservatives and liberals, Pharisees and Sadducees, united in a political union for political expediency to crucify God in the flesh because they were not operating by the principles of selfless love, which includes justice for the vulnerable and the oppressed. In fact, they were offended by how Christ interjected himself into the political structure of Israel and put those who were suffering and in pain and who were oppressed and who were vulnerable and lifted them up and cared for them and healed them. Instead, the group was operating on the principles of self-centeredness, which always grows into hatred. You see, all sin is selfish. And all sin is murderous in its intent. Even though it may not be murder, it is murderous in its intent. And why is it murderous in its intent? Because it puts me before you. And when push comes to shove, if I'm putting myself before you, you're going down before me. Now, you might remember the old joke of the two hikers in the woods. And they spot a bear. And the hiker asks the other one, says, "Do you think you can outrun that bear?" And the other hiker says, "Well, I don't have to. I only have to outrun you." That's comical, but that's the way we often actually truly do think. I only have to worry about myself. I don't have to worry about you. Sin is always putting one's self first. Let me ask you this. Do you feel more comfortable with people who share your political beliefs, but not your faith? Or more comfortable with people who share your faith, but not your political beliefs? The real question is, does the gospel inform our politics, or do our politics inform our gospel? Again, when I talk about the gospel here, I'm talking about the living gospel. in how we interact with each other within the systems that we set up to govern us, because we're specifically talking about how Christians should work and relate to political systems within the government. Excuse me. Christians should be neutral in partisan politics, but they should not be neutral between the oppressor and the oppressed. Partisan politics is the regular scrambling for the levers of power where you are identified by your political allegiance instead of by your human relationships within society and whether you are treating the marginalized with fairness and justice or not. By the way, our country has never treated the marginalized with fairness and equality and justice. It just simply has not. And to this day, people are still suffering from that, which is why you see the protests. Yes, 93% of the protests out there are perfectly peaceful. But some are so frustrated by what they have experienced that they have taken that frustration to a level that is also unjust. But we as Christians need to be attacking and working to fix the underlying causes that create those scenarios. While Christians should not generally align themselves strictly with one party or another, they can make temporary alliances with either party on issues relating to justice or injustice in society, much as Ellen White, one of the founders and writers within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, much as she and the other pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church did. I mention that here because I'm talking not just to regular Christians, I'm talking to Christians of all faith, but I'm specifically talking to my own church that they need to understand. They took sides. They fought for justice to right the injustices and wrongs and immoral things that were occurring in the structures of government. And we've talked about that in a previous video, so I won't go back into it here. Unfortunately, typically politicians can't pull this off and being on the side of righteousness, one side of it, because they always are all in for one party or another because they're in it to win it, not to do what is best for society. But as Christian justice seekers, we should be willing to work with either side as long as they are pursuing justice and truth, and reject them if they aren't. We can even work with both sides at the same time, if it means protecting the vulnerable and the oppressed. We should be known for our principles rather than our politics. So in what way should I as a Christian be involved in politics? Our moral obligations politically extend to anyone, anywhere there is pain and suffering, particularly if that pain and suffering is inflicted at the hands of an entity that we call the state, for which we are responsible for creating via our vote, because the state is theoretically instituted to protect those relationships. Because politics is really about relationships. To that end, we must be involved in politics. This is why the issues of police brutality are not black issues. As a white Christian, I should be just as concerned about police officers killing unarmed black people as I should be if I were black. After all, in the Old Testament, the Bible tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus repeated that. But also, Jesus took that to another level entirely when he said, "A new command I give you, to love one another as I have loved you. And by this, they will know that you are my disciples." Are you a disciple of Christ? Am I? Do I love you as Christ loved me? And how did Christ love me? He put me ahead of himself. And he was all powerful. He didn't have to. He created us. But he chose to die in our stead so that we never have to die. And when I talk about death, I'm talking about eternal death. He suffered that separation from his Father, which was a perfect union of love. Because he loved you so much and wants to spend eternity with you. That's our God. That's our Creator. So any place where we see suffering is where we should see the Christian being involved. And not just from the personal perspective. Yes, that has a very important place. We have ADRA in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which helps those during times of disaster, giving them relief. We contribute to that with our coffers, our funds, and we help out also in times of distress, helping people. That's the loving individual thing to do. But it transcends when we have a loving character that desires the suffering and pain and oppression to end, and we live within a democracy. We have an obligation to be involved in a way that structures those governmental systems so that they are sensitive to the oppression and suffering that they may be overlooking or even causing. Christians will often take sides and vote for political candidates or parties based on a specific wedge issue. This, I think, can often be very wrong-headed and even immoral in a multitude of levels, but primarily because it often ignores a host of other evils committed at the hands of governmental systems. For instance, one might say you should vote for this party to stop police brutality. Another will say, well, yeah, but you should vote for this party to protect the unborn. But here's the problem. On the one side, such as voting to stop police brutality, you see people actually suffering at the hands of a political system, a governmental structure, the judicial system, an entity such as law enforcement and the courts and the prison system. And we are responsible for controlling that. On the other hand, when talking about the unborn, we are not talking about the oppression of people by a government entity, but rather about individual choices people are making regarding what they consider to be themselves. Voting may change the system or entity that needs to be changed, that is allowing oppression and injustices to occur, but we are unlikely to change an individual's actions regarding one's own body. We know this from the war on drugs. We also know this from years ago. We used to make homosexuality illegal. There's a good movie out there that I encourage you all to watch, and I can't remember the exact, I think it might be called Enigma, but it was about the decoding machine that the Germans used in World War II, and there was a gay person, very intelligent, very smart, who figured it out and helped the British actually crack that code. And yet, because he was gay, he was oppressed, and it's all about his oppression and how horribly he was treated as an individual. Whether we agree with or disagree with the lifestyle of a gay person, we should love that person. We should respect that person. God loves that person as much as he loves you. And this is what I'm talking about. When you try to legislate something individually, it never works. because it drives that underground, because it's something with the individual's personage that is occurring. But here's the thing. From a moral standpoint, it's a mistake for the Christian to just reduce his or her moral obligation to the question of voting in a presidential or any other election, for that matter, over a single wedge issue. This is because our moral obligations as Christians transcends electoral politics. In other words, regardless of who wins the presidential election in a month or two, there will, because who knows how long it's going to take to get the count in, there will continue to be oppression and injustice. It isn't the case that whoever wins is going to somehow magically end oppression or abortion overnight. Keep in mind, either the Constitution or the Supreme Court interpretation of the Constitution will have to change in order for things like abortion to be made legal, or illegal, I should say. Even then, abortions will occur as they did before Roe v. Wade, because this is an individual choice about what people perceive as that individual's body. Regardless of how you look at abortion, the one thing we know that abortion is not, it is not a governmental system that we put in place by our vote that is oppressing the poor, the sick, the hungry, the homeless, the single mother, the imprisoned, and the alien. Abortion is an individual act by an individual on that person's body. It is not an act of oppression by a group of people at the hands of a governmental system that we are responsible for creating through our vote. When it comes to politics, we as Christians should be concerned most about correcting those oppressive systems of government over which we have control by our vote. In doing that, we will in fact impact abortions by once again addressing the social injustices that actually drive people to have abortions in the first place, such as poverty. Additionally, we know some abortions, such as abortions for rape and incest, the life of the mother and viability of the fetus, must be allowed if we're going to be compassionate, loving Christians. Abortions of convenience are absolutely immoral and against the loving character of God. But they are not governmental systems of oppression set up by our vote. They are immoral personal decisions, just like overuse of alcohol, drug or alcohol abuse, or any other devastating practice against one's own body. That said, abortions are being driven by unjust governmental systems that do oppress the poor and the vulnerable. And the Christian's obligation is to change those oppressive governmental systems that drive women to have abortions in the first place. What I mean by this is simply this. When you look at the reasons why why women have abortions, it's often because they're single, they're financially not able to have to support the child, they're afraid of all those things that occur, and are afraid for their child to grow up in either in an abusive relationship or in a dangerous environment or a poverty-stricken environment. All those are social systems that we can impact and change by how we treat those who are vulnerable. And addressing those will reduce the number of abortions that occur. Simply allowing abortions, simply outline abortions, right or wrong, does nothing to help those in need who are driven to abort their pregnancy. Additionally, as anti-abortionists, we can be just as wrongly and immorally oppressive towards the rape victim or the mother who is suffering from a severe pregnancy illness. We actually lack love and compassion for the mother whose fetus is deformed such that it won't live if we end up preventing her from having an abortion. What a horrible thing for us to impose on an individual. That should be left up to the mother in those particular cases. When dealing with the abortion issue, we can act in such a way that we are not in accordance with the will of God by outright banning all abortions, even those where the mother is suffering. We must remember, I think, that our legal systems of government govern us externally, but as Christians, we are to be governed internally by our love for God and our love for our neighbors. Man attempts to legislate morality by trying to control the hands and the feet of other men by exerting force and control. God governs and changes the heart, thereby controlling the hands and the feet through love and compassion and free will. It changes the motive and the desire of the individual from their heart, and that changes what the actions of that individual. Now, I just used abortion as an example, but there are many other examples that we come to, and I did talk about other types of laws in the past that have been wrong headed in their thinking, that were set up because of and we were trying to actually change the moral of that individual, and it had nothing to do with how oppressive our governmental system was. In fact, we actually had to change those laws or get people in place to change those laws before they became less oppressive for the marginalized and the vulnerable. So don't think that I'm picking on abortion particularly, because there are other areas within our legal systems that try to legislate private morality within an individual's life. I think they probably are well intended, but they miss the mark. What I'm talking about here, though, is the Christian and how they approach politics. When we approach politics, we should be focused on those things that change those governmental structures that are actually oppressing or not mitigating the oppression and suffering and pain of others. So if we are desiring to change the human nature of an individual, that must be worked on from a personal spiritual perspective with the individual. On the other hand, if we're talking about ending governmental systems that allow for the oppression of those most in need, then that is something we must use our rights and responsibilities within our democracy to change. So if I love God and I love my neighbor, that is to say that if I am motivated by love, to love on both tablets of the Decalogue, I don't need threat of punishment to refrain from lying or thieving or murdering or adultery or even abortion. That's not to say we shouldn't have laws governing those things. We should. But those laws are best served when they focus on governing societal relationships between people to prevent oppression and harm of one person by another or one governmental entity toward others. Love for God and my fellow man drives me as a Christian. And the real difficult challenge for the Christian is to learn the moral and spiritual work of internal governance, because one may comply with the law outwardly and be thoroughly immoral. We've seen this in our government over the past 3 years and in the years leading up to the crash of 2008. This, in some sense, is the lesson of Jesus to the Pharisees. His teaching to them was, you may comply with the law externally, you may comply with the letter of the law, but it is the spirit of the law that is the call for the Christian. We see this all the time today. That was the problem, of course, as I mentioned, leading up to 2008. Evil men in 2008 were doing legal things, but were doing them immorally, and it caused the collapse of our economic system. So when it comes to the Christian and politics, we must be governed by the same moral principles that Christ was governed by, which is selfless love toward one another. That is the kingdom of God. That is the kingdom of God that the Christian should be living within. Our participation should be driven by those principles that are concerned with the oppressed, the vulnerable, the marginalized, disadvantaged. That is to say, the least of these, as outlined in Matthew 25. When that oppression comes from governmental policies or systems that we can actually impact by our vote, that's where our participation needs to be involved. So I hope, as I kind of wrap this second session up, I hope that over the past couple of videos, you've learned a few things. We are never exempt from politics in the sense that we are people living in relationships with one another and in a society. There is no way to avoid politics for the Christian unless you are completely removed from the human race. Only death truly ends your involvement in politics. Remember, even if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you. Failure to act, to mitigate and to change oppressive governmental systems and structures, or those systems and structures that are ignoring oppression as systemic issues that oppress people, whether they be people of color, people that are in poverty, whatever they might be. Ignoring those things, allowing our governmental systems to ignore those things is wrong-headed of us. Jesus was intensely political because he interjected himself into the human political system and focused on those socio-political relationships between the governing system of the Sanhedrin and the Jewish people. Jesus did not accept the status quo and worked to change it. The prophets throughout the Bible were known as, I've said and mentioned, moral auditors who spoke truth to power and also worked to change the governmental system to align with the heart of God. God does take sides. While he is pulling for everyone's salvation, he has always been on the side of the oppressed. As Christians, motivated by Christ's love for us, we too should find ourselves on the side of the oppressed. As Christians, we should be involved in politics in the same way that the prophets were involved and the way that Christ was involved, not by force, but by love for the oppressed, by utilizing our vote to vote for the politicians whom are most likely to end the oppressive governmental systems, or those systems that are not mitigating the oppression and harm that is being done to vulnerable people. We should be voting for those politicians most likely to help the poor, the sick, the homeless, the hungry, the imprisoned, the alien, the vulnerable, marginalized, and disadvantaged. So this brings us to the end of our second in this series. I hope these videos are helping you as a Christian and as a Seventh-day Adventist to navigate the socio-political environment of today that can be so volatile. I also hope it is helping you to understand the difference between forceful control of other individuals, which is always ungodly, versus control over governmental systems to change them in a way that helps the vulnerable of society. We can impact the one with our vote, but can only truly impact the individual with the loving, caring, compassionate gospel of Christ. It is my intent now to continue this series in about a week. I hope to have the third and final video completed in about a week, maybe two. And then you can put them all together. Hopefully you're viewing them as they come out. Hopefully they're helping you to understand how to mitigate all this and to navigate all this that's going on today. Stay close to God, my brothers and sisters. I love you guys. May God bless you and keep you safe and well.